I was cutting the bone when the phone rang, and I knew, absolutely knew it was him. It was 1:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, the kind of wet, miserable November night where the fog hugs the alleys and you can hear the drip of the eaves inside your skull. I was in the back of my small butcher shop, the tender cut, prepping a carcass for the morning rush, a beautiful, massive hog I'd driven 2 hours to get. My hands were slick with fat and cold blood, the long bone saw resting on the steel table. The phone wasn't supposed to ring. I'd shut off the landline and my cell was silenced. I looked at the old, cracked receiver mounted by the meat grinder. It was a faint, insistent trill-trill, not ringing out loud but vibrating, glowing with a soft, malevolent green light. I hadn't seen it do that in years. It was the emergency line, the one I'd wired myself, the direct line to the old answering machine in the abandoned office upstairs. I wiped my hands on the rough apron, trying to keep my breathing even. Don't be stupid, Ray. It's a crossed wire, a glitch. But my stomach was a fist of ice. I moved slow, my rubber boots squeaking slightly on the concrete floor. The air conditioning unit hummed a low, ominous note, the only other sound. I picked up the receiver. It felt strangely warm. "Hello," my voice was a dry croak. A mechanical, utterly flat voice answered. No static, no hiss, just pure digitized sound. "You missed one, Raymond." I dropped the saw. It hit the table with a deafening clang. "Who is this?" "You have the wrong number," I lied, my heart hammering against my ribs. I hadn't been called Raymond since I was a kid. Only he used that name. "The one with the silver locket, the little flower design," the voice continued, ignoring me. "She's still breathing, barely. You need to finish the job." My blood went cold. The silver locket. It was tucked away in a shoebox in the attic, the only thing I'd kept. How could he know that detail? How could he know I was even awake? A horrifying thought twisted in my mind. Is he watching me right now? I backed up slowly, scanning the narrow windows high on the wall, the ones frosted over with the grime of 20 years. They were dark. They were solid. "I don't know what you're talking about," I whispered, the sound barely carrying over the hum. "Don't insult my intelligence, Butcher. November is the month of the thinning veil, the harvest. You know the rules. Loose ends attract attention, and attention is bad for business." He hung up. No click, no dial tone, just silence. The green light on the phone went dark. I stood there trembling, the scent of fresh blood suddenly cloying and suffocating. She's still breathing. That was the real horror. I thought I had taken care of everything, every trace, every thread 10 years ago. It had been messy, yes, but complete. It had to be. My whole life was built on that completion. I grabbed the heavy meat cleaver, the one with the notched blade, and went straight for the basement door. This was the moment where I should have called the police, but I couldn't. Not after all this time. If this was a setup, if this was a mistake, a prank, I'd destroy myself and everything I'd built. What if this person was just trying to scare me into doing something stupid? The basement steps groaned under my weight. The air down here was colder, smelling of damp earth and old coal dust. I flicked on the single bare bulb. It swung slightly, casting jittery, sickly yellow shadows. I went straight to the corner where the concrete floor looked slightly darker, a faint discoloration hidden beneath 2 large, stacked wooden crates. I pushed them aside. The floor beneath was a different shade of gray, a patch I had poured myself one rainy night in late November years ago. I ran my cleaver blade along the seam. The concrete was dense and solid, nothing disturbed. I felt a surge of relief so intense it made my knees weak. It's a lie. He's playing with me. But then I noticed it. Something small, not on the floor but wedged in the slight gap between the wall and the new concrete pour. I knelt, scraping it out with the tip of the cleaver. It was a piece of cheap, white lace, a strip of old lingerie trim, the kind she had been wearing that night. My breath hitched. I scrambled back up the stairs, leaving the cleaver behind. I was running now, straight for the back exit. I needed air. I needed to see a street lamp, a car, anything alive. I yanked the heavy bolt and shoved the steel door open. The fog was denser than ever, a thick, cold soup that swallowed the streetlights whole. It was silent, too silent. The kind of silence that feels like a weight on your chest. My small delivery van was parked 50 feet away under a single flickering gas lamp, and leaning against the back door of the van, a dark silhouette stood, a person, tall, still. I froze in the doorway. My eyes struggled to penetrate the mist, but I could make out a shape and something in its hand. It wasn't moving, just waiting. "Who are you?" I shouted, the sound swallowed immediately by the fog. The figure tilted its head, a motion that was too slow, too deliberate. The small, dark object in its hand lifted slightly, catching the faint light from the gas lamp. It was the silver locket, the little flower design. My mind raced. How did he get it? It was supposed to be in the attic in the shoebox, taped shut. Did he break in? Was this just a warning, or had he been inside the house the whole time I was on the phone? I slammed the back door shut, the heavy steel shaking the frame. I didn't lock it. I just ran, stumbling past the meat hooks and the grinder, back toward the front of the shop. The main counter was spotless, but as I rounded the corner, I saw the one thing that made every hair on my body stand on end. On the wooden cutting block, neatly arranged beside the cash register, was a single, perfect pile of pennies. Exactly 10 of them. One for every year since I buried the past. And right next to the pennies, a simple, handwritten note scrawled on a slip of butcher paper. The note said, "Your harvest is rotten. Dig deeper, Raymond, the clock is ticking." I looked at the clock over the door. 1:33 a.m. 17 minutes had passed. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely pick up the note. The paper was dry, no blood, no fingerprints, but the ink was dark, fresh. "He's in the building." I knew I couldn't run. If I left, he would stay, and what would I come back to? I grabbed a boning knife, sharp, thin, and fast, and pressed my back to the cold tile wall. The silence returned, but now it felt different. It was the silence of a predator waiting for its prey to make a move. I waited 5 minutes, then 10. My senses were screaming. Every shadow was a shape, every creak of the old building was a footstep. Where is he? Then I heard a sound from the floor above. Not a creak of wood, but something heavy being dragged. The sound was coming from the abandoned office. The office where the green glowing emergency phone was wired to the answering machine. I had to see. I had to know if he was dragging her out. I crept to the stairs leading up to the office, the knife held low. The air grew stale and cold as I ascended. The old wooden door to the office was usually bolted shut. Now it was slightly ajar, a dark sliver cutting into the gloom. I pushed the door open, my heart a trapped bird. The room was empty. Dust motes danced in the pale moonlight filtering through the grimy window. The ancient desk was there, the chair was pushed in. Everything was as it had been for a decade. But on the desk, sitting right next to the answering machine, was the shoebox from my attic. It was open. The tape was cleanly cut. I knew what was missing, but I checked anyway. The locket was gone. Then I looked at the answering machine. A small red light was blinking slowly. It meant there was one new message. I reached out and pressed the play button. The flat, mechanical voice filled the silent room. "You're standing on her, Raymond. November nights are cold. She wants to be warm." I backed away, stumbling over the desk chair. I looked down at the floorboards beneath my feet. They were old, splintered, and solid. But the voice said I was standing on her. I looked at the ceiling above me, the roof. No. I looked at the floor below me, the butcher shop. No. Then I understood, the office floor. There was a hollow sound to the room, an echo that shouldn't be there. The space beneath the floorboards, an old crawl space meant for utility lines. I'd forgotten about it. I dropped the knife and started pulling at the nearest floorboard, tearing at the wood with my bare hands. Splinters drove into my skin, but I didn't feel it. I pulled until the board cracked. Underneath, in the absolute dark, there was a smell, a deep, earthy, sickening sweet smell. And then a tiny, almost inaudible sound, a dry, scraping sound like fingernails on dirt. Who is this person, and how did they get her down here? More importantly, why did they wait 10 years to make me listen? I peered into the black gap, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The November wind howled a low moan outside, and in the darkness below, something shifted. Something long, white, and thin reached up, brushing my trembling fingers. It felt strangely like bone. I screamed, a raw animal sound, and scrambled away, knocking over the desk. The knife was gone, my phone was in the shop, and the killer, the puppet master, was still out there, somewhere in the November fog, smiling. And I realized I had just dug up my own grave. Story 2. The first week of November had turned the isolated cabin into a gray, perpetually damp tomb. My name is Elias, and I came up here to the foothills of the Cascades to finish my novel, a project requiring absolute silence and zero distraction. I got the silence, all right. The nearest neighbor is a retired park ranger 5 miles down a dirt road that's already turning to mud. It was Tuesday and the light was dead by 4:35 p.m. I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the screen and failing to write a single coherent sentence. I had the antique oil lamp burning, mostly for atmosphere, but also because the power flickers up here constantly. Outside, the wind made the fir trees sound like they were whispering urgent, terrible secrets. That's when I noticed the small thing. The salt shaker wasn't where I left it. I'm a creature of habit, obsessively so. When I finish a meal, I push the white porcelain shaker exactly 1 inch from the edge of the table, directly in line with the pepper mill. I remember doing it at lunch, a tuna sandwich I didn't even taste. Now the salt shaker was shifted. It was 2 inches from the edge, tilted slightly, as if someone had nudged it while passing. I told myself it was me. Elias, you're sleep-deprived. You did it yourself and forgot. I got up, walked to the window, and stared out into the dense wall of pines. It was so dark I couldn't even see the rusted mailbox at the end of the short drive. The only light was the weak glow reflecting off the fog from the town about 30 miles away. I went back to the table, centered the salt shaker, and taped a tiny piece of blue painter's tape exactly where the base rested. Paranoid much, Elias? I laughed out loud, a dry, uncomfortable sound. The next day, Wednesday, the storm really hit. Rain hammered the roof like gravel and the wind screamed through the chimney. Around 2 p.m. the power died, not a flicker, but a solid, final thunk of silence. I lit 2 lamps and settled in with a blanket. I walked to the table around 6 p.m. to light a 3rd lamp. I stopped dead. The blue tape was still on the table. The salt shaker was still on the blue tape, but next to it on the polished wood was a single brown pine needle. The windows were all closed. The fireplace was sealed. I hadn't opened the front door since yesterday morning to haul in firewood. There were no houseplants, nothing that could shed a pine needle inside the cabin. I picked it up. It was dry, brittle, and smelled faintly of wood smoke and cold earth. It hadn't come from the firewood pile. Those were thick, wet logs. This was a recent drop, maybe from a branch snapped in the wind. My heart started to pound. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't me. Someone had been in the cabin while I was in the bedroom reading. I immediately went through the mental checklist. Doors locked, yes. Windows latched, yes. But the cabin is old. The back door lock is rusty and loose. And there is a small, high crawl space window in the pantry that I'd forgotten to check since summer. I grabbed the heavy iron fire poker, my only weapon, and went straight for the pantry. The window was dark, spiderwebbed, and looked sealed shut. But I ran my hand along the sill and felt something I shouldn't have, a faint, oily smudge. I felt sick. Whoever it was, they were small, a child, No, a child wouldn't leave a professional dark smudge. This was deliberate, a message. Why didn't they take anything? I spent the next hour barricading the back door with an old chest of drawers and jamming a wedge under the front door. I checked every cupboard, every corner. Nothing was missing. No further signs. I couldn't write. I couldn't read. I sat by the fireplace with the poker, staring into the dancing flames, occasionally glancing at the dark windows. Was the person still outside? Were they waiting for me to go to sleep? Around midnight, the fire was down to coals. The cabin was deathly cold. I needed to sleep. I tried to convince myself that maybe the needle had fallen out of my jacket. The smudge, I must have done it myself. The salt shaker, my imagination. Just as I was about to stand up, I heard it, a sound from directly above me. A faint, dry scratching sound. I lived on the ground floor. Above me was the attic, a cramped, unheated space only accessible by a pull-down ladder in the hallway. I hadn't been up there in months. I grabbed the fire poker, my hands slick with cold sweat. I moved slowly, silently, toward the hallway, the only light coming from the embers in the living room. I stood directly beneath the attic hatch. The latch mechanism was a simple hook, and I knew it was locked. I always locked it. The scratching continued, louder now, sounding like a desperate rat scrabbling at wood. Then it stopped. It was replaced by a new sound, a slow, deliberate thump, thump, thump. It sounded like bare heels hitting the rough planks above. Someone was walking around in my attic. How did they get in? And why were they making noise now? I backed into the living room, terrified. I kept the poker leveled at the ceiling. I wanted to scream, but the cold had locked my throat. The walking stopped right above my head. The silence was worse than the sound. Then the voice came. It was a low, rusty whisper, muffled by the ceiling, but absolutely clear. "He sees you, Elias." I dropped the poker. It clattered loudly on the wooden floor. The voice spoke again, the whisper now laced with a chilling, dry chuckle. "He likes the blanket." I looked down at the thick wool blanket pulled up to my chin. It was a new one, dark green, bought just before I came up here. No one knew I had it. I stumbled toward the kitchen, my mind dissolving into pure panic. I needed to get out. My keys, my phone, and my jacket were by the front door, right under the attic entrance. As I took one step, the latch on the attic hatch snicked open. A cloud of dust and cobwebs drifted down. Did they just unlock it from the inside? I froze, looking up. The rectangular black hole of the open hatch was now visible in the gloom. I waited, heart pounding, for a foot to drop down, for a shape to emerge. Nothing, just the black square and the cold, damp air rushing down. I backed up again slowly toward the window. I could smash the glass, climb out, and run into the woods. That seemed like my only chance. As I retreated, my hand brushed the kitchen table, and I saw the last, most terrifying change of all. The salt shaker was gone. In its place, centered precisely where the blue tape had marked its perimeter, was a small, neatly folded square of my writing paper. I forced myself to pick it up. The paper was slightly damp. I unfolded it by the weak lamplight. Scribbled in neat, clear handwriting, my own handwriting but shaky, was a sentence. "The ending is all wrong. Try a chase scene." My blood ran cold. That sentence. It was the exact thought I had had on Monday when the salt shaker first moved. It was the sentence I was too afraid to write down, the thought I had dismissed. How could they know my unspoken thoughts? Was this person me, or someone who had been inside my head all along? A shadow detached itself from the gloom outside the window. It wasn't a reflection. It was a silhouette pressed close to the glass, so close I could almost feel its breath. It was tall, motionless, and dressed in something dark that blended perfectly with the November night. I didn't wait to see its face. I bolted for the front door, slamming my shoulder into the old chest of drawers blocking the back exit. The chest moved just enough. I kicked the chest back and threw myself through the rear door. The rain hit me like a physical blow. I was soaked instantly. I ran blindly into the pitch-black woods, not toward the road but away from the cabin. As I vanished into the maze of trees, I heard a new sound rise above the wind and the rain. The sound of gentle, slow, and appreciative clapping coming from the front of the cabin, right where the watcher stood. Story 3. My name is Clara, and I remember the exact moment the cabin started to breathe. It was November 8th, just after the first real snow. The kind of snow that doesn't melt, just piles up, silencing everything. I'd been alone for 4 weeks, tending to my late uncle's remote fishing cabin on the edge of Lake Superior, overseeing some repairs before winter truly bit down. My phone had died days ago, and the nearest town was a 4-hour drive, now impassable. I was boiling water for instant coffee, watching the steam curl up to the low ceiling, when the floorboard under the old rug in the living room gave a soft, shuddering creak. Not settling, I thought, more like a sigh. I froze. I'd walked over that particular board 100 times. It always creaked, yes, but this was different. This was organic, like something shifting its weight. I tiptoed to the edge of the rug and pressed my foot down gently. Nothing. I tried again, firmer, still nothing. Clara, you're alone. You're jumpy. I tried to laugh it off, but the sound felt thin in the heavy silence. The only company I had was the wind, a mournful thing that whistled through the gaps in the old log walls, and the slow, groaning expansion of the ice on the lake. That night it got worse. I was trying to sleep, bundled in 3 blankets, listening to the lake ice sing its eerie, low-frequency hum. Then I heard it again, not a creak this time, a faint, dragging sound from under the cabin. The cabin was built on stone piers, with a shallow crawl space underneath, mostly filled with dirt and rock. My uncle always warned me never to go under there, said snakes liked it, and the ground was unstable. The dragging sound was slow, rhythmic, scratch, drag, pause, scratch, drag, pause, like something heavy being pulled through loose dirt. My eyes snapped open. I held my breath, listening. It seemed to be coming from directly beneath my bed. I slid out of bed, my feet hitting the frigid wooden floor. I grabbed the old, heavy iron poker from beside the wood stove. My hands were shaking. I knelt down, pressing my ear to the floorboards. The sound stopped. Absolute silence. Was it an animal, a badger, a raccoon? But the dragging sounded too deliberate, too heavy for any small creature I knew. And why had it stopped the moment I moved? I spent the rest of the night sitting by the stove, watching the shadows dance, jumping at every groan of the old timber. My mind started to play tricks on me. The shadows in the corners looked like hunched figures. The wind sounded like whispered words. Was I just going insane from the isolation? The next morning, the snow was even deeper. I tried to walk to the shed for more firewood, but the drifts were waist deep. I had to turn back. I was trapped. That afternoon, I noticed something else. The kitchen window. It had a small, almost invisible crack in the lower pane, a flaw I knew well. Now the crack seemed to have lengthened slightly, curving upward like a thin, black hair. I ran my finger over it. It wasn't just longer, it felt sharper, like a fresh break. But how? Nothing had hit the window. I remembered a story my uncle used to tell about the old trapper who built this cabin. Said he went mad, believed the cabin itself was alive, shifting and growing around him. I'd always dismissed it as an old wives' tale. Now I wasn't so sure. Was the cabin truly changing, or was my mind simply inventing new horrors? As the November dusk bled across the snow-covered lake, I decided I had to check under the cabin. The sounds, the crack, the feeling of being watched, I couldn't endure another night of not knowing. I went to the back of the cabin where the small, square access hatch was usually secured with a rusted padlock. My uncle always kept it locked. Now it was ajar. The padlock hung open, snapped at the shackle. My blood ran cold. This wasn't an animal. Someone or something had been in there. I took a deep breath, grabbed a battery-powered lantern and slowly pulled the hatch open. A gust of frigid, earthy air rushed out, carrying a faint, musty smell. The beam of the lantern cut through the darkness, illuminating a shallow, dirt-floored space. It was too low to stand, but I could crawl. My heart hammered against my ribs. What if whoever was down there was still there? I lowered myself in, belly crawling through the icy dirt. The lantern beam danced across old foundations, dusty cobwebs, and smooth, water-worn rocks. My breath plumed in front of me. I crawled for a few feet, then stopped. There, directly beneath where my bed was, the dirt was disturbed. A long, shallow trough had been scraped into the earth, leading from one corner of the cabin, under my sleeping area, and disappearing into the darkness toward the lake side. It was exactly where the dragging sound had come from. I followed the trough. My knees ached, my clothes were filthy. The smell grew stronger here, not just earth, but something else, something metallic, something animalistic. The trough ended abruptly at a larger, deeper hole. Not a hole I dug. It looked like a shallow, crude grave freshly excavated. And inside it, resting on the damp earth, was a single, perfectly smooth white stone. Not a lake stone, too round, too uniform. It looked like a knuckle bone. My mind screamed, "No, it's just a rock," but my stomach churned. And then I heard the sound again, not the dragging. This time it was a faint, wet slurp sound, coming from just beyond the hole, deeper in the crawl space. I froze, the lantern beam shaking wildly. Was it a person, an actual person, hidden in the dark, watching me? "Hello," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The slurping stopped, absolute terrifying silence. I waited. My fear was so intense it felt like a physical weight pressing down on me. I thought about scrambling back out, but a morbid curiosity, a desperate need to understand, kept me pinned. Then from the darkness just beyond the bone-like stone, I saw it. Two small, pale green lights, glowing faintly, steadily, like eyes. They were low to the ground, maybe 2 feet apart. My breath hitched. They were not human eyes. They were too large, too luminous. They were still, watching me. I pushed myself backwards, scraping my elbows on the rough wood. I had to get out. I had to get out now. As I backed away, the green lights began to move, slowly, deliberately, following me. I scrambled backwards, my heart threatening to explode. I couldn't get a clear look. The space was too cramped, too dark. But I heard the dragging sound again, faster this time, accompanied by a low, guttural snuffling sound. I burst out of the hatch, gasping for air, covered in dirt and ice. I slammed the hatch shut, fumbling for the broken padlock. It was useless. I grabbed a heavy log and jammed it against the hatch. I stumbled back into the cabin, shivering uncontrollably, not just from the cold, but from the primal terror. I locked the front door, checked the windows, and grabbed the axe from beside the fireplace. I lit every lamp, every candle. The cabin was a beacon in the encroaching November night. I huddled by the stove, clutching the axe. The green eyes, the dragging, the slurping. It wasn't an animal, it wasn't a person. What was under my cabin, and how did it get in? Hours passed. The wind howled. The ice on the lake groaned. Every creak of the old cabin felt like a step, every gust of wind a breath. Then I heard it, from inside the cabin, coming from the living room. A faint dragging sound, scratch, drag, pause. My blood ran cold. I had just come from the crawl space. There was no way anything could have gotten in. I had sealed it. I crept to the living room doorway, axe raised. The old rug was still there, rumpled. The floorboard beneath it was silent. But then the dragging sound came again, right beneath the floor, but this time it was accompanied by something new. A wet, soft gurgling. And a single, clear, undeniable whisper, like air escaping a lung, coming from directly under the rug. "You found my toy, Clara. Now I found yours." I dropped the axe with a clang. My uncle's old wooden fishing lure, the one he'd carved himself, the one I kept for good luck, was no longer hanging above the fireplace. It was lying on the rug, directly over the creaking floorboard, freshly gnawed with teeth marks deep in the wood. I screamed, a primal, raw sound that tore through the cabin. I scrambled for the front door, unlocked it, and plunged into the relentless November snow, not caring about the cold, not caring about the storm, just needing to get away from the breathing cabin. As I ran, stumbling through the deep, unbroken snow, I glanced back. Through the kitchen window, I saw the pale green lights, two of them now brighter, larger, filling the pane. They were no longer low to the ground. They were at eye level. What was watching me from inside my own home? And was I running from a monster or from the ghost of my own unraveling mind? Story 4. The temperature gauge inside my tiny, fifth-floor apartment read 41 degrees. It was the second week of November, and the city was blacked out. A massive, freak ice storm had taken out the entire grid across the state. I'm Marcus, a 20-something remote programmer, and I was freezing, trapped in a concrete box with only a handful of candles and the awful silence of a major metropolis gone dark. The terror started with the mail. At 3 p.m., just as the last miserable sliver of daylight vanished behind the soot-stained buildings, I heard a clatter at my door. Not a knock, but the thin, tinny sound of something falling through the mail slot onto the worn carpet. I picked it up. It wasn't a bill. It was a single, laminated photo ID card. It was a driver's license. The picture was a close-up of a man in his late 40s, gaunt, sharp cheekbones and dark, intense eyes. He wasn't smiling, he was just staring. I flipped it over. The name was Victor Hale. The address listed on the card was my own address, only the apartment number was different. 3B, I live in 5C. I didn't know of Victor Hale. I've lived here for 2 years and barely talked to my neighbors. The idea of walking down to the 3rd floor, knocking on a stranger's door in a total blackout and asking, "Hey, is this you?" made my stomach clench. I dropped the ID on the counter, telling myself it was a coincidence. He must have slipped it into the wrong slot. End of story. But then I noticed the date of birth. It was today's date, November 14th. I lit a candle and sat in the dark, watching the ID card reflect the weak flame. Why was his birthday the day of the blackout? Was that a coincidence, or was it a message? Around 8 p.m., the cold was unbearable. I layered up and decided I needed to be social or I'd lose my mind. I took my flashlight and went down to the 2nd floor, where an elderly couple, the Millers, were known to be friendly. I walked down the dark, echoing stairwell. The only sound was the scrape of my boots and the drip, drip, drip of melting ice somewhere high up. Every apartment door was a black void. When I reached the 2nd floor, I flashed the light across the hallway. The hallway was empty, but on the floor, directly in front of the Miller's door, was a single, perfect pile of white powder. It looked like flour. I crouched down. It was fine, chalky, and slightly greasy. I touched it. It smelled faintly metallic, like old pennies. And leading away from the pile toward the stairwell were 3 clear, large boot prints embedded in the fine dust. They were heading up. I didn't knock on the Miller's door. I just turned and ran back up the stairs, skipping 2 steps at a time. The prints were too big for a woman, too purposeful for a maintenance worker. They were heading right past my floor. I sprinted the rest of the way to 5C, through the deadbolt, and jammed a wedge under the door. I looked at the ID card on my counter. Victor Hale. If he lived on 3B, why were his prints heading up to the 5th or higher? I went to the tiny kitchen window and looked out. Nothing. Just the vast, black canyon of buildings shrouded in the heavy, still air of the blackout. Then I saw a light. 1 window 3 buildings over, 2 floors higher than me. A single, very bright blue light. It wasn't a flashlight or a candle. It was sharp, focused, and steady. And it was pointing directly at my window. I stumbled backward, knocking over the chair. I crawled to the edge of the window frame, peering out from behind the curtain. The light didn't move. It was fixed on my apartment. I ran to the opposite wall, heart pounding. If he's watching me, he saw me look out. I extinguished my single candle, plunging the apartment into absolute darkness. I waited, breathing shallowly. The only sound was the pounding in my ears. I knew I needed to confirm the address. Maybe Victor Hale lived in 5C before me. Maybe the ID was old. I fumbled for my laptop. It had about 10% battery life. I flipped it open and the weak glow illuminated the room. I typed in the address. The screen loaded a grainy street view. I zoomed in on the apartment building's main entrance. And there, standing in the doorway, caught in the sun of the archival photo, was Victor Hale, the same intense stare. I checked the timestamp on the photo, November 14th, 2 years ago. He lived here. He was here 2 years ago on his birthday. Is he here now? I heard a new sound, not from the outside, but from the inner wall of my apartment. The wall separating my unit, 5C, from the neighbor's unit, 5B. It was a quiet, relentless tapping, like a hammer lightly, repeatedly hitting concrete. Tap, 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 tap. My neighbor, a quiet history student, was supposedly out of town for the Thanksgiving break, but the tapping was methodical. It had a rhythm. I pressed my ear to the cold wall. The tapping stopped immediately. I waited, nothing. Then from the mail slot on my front door, I heard it again, the thin, metallic clatter. I crawled toward the door, shining the laptop screen's dim light toward the floor. A new item had been pushed through. It was a single, small, crumpled piece of paper. I picked it up. It was a receipt, a grocery receipt from a store 3 miles away. The date was today. The time was 4:15 p.m. I was sitting inside my apartment at 4:15 p.m. Encircled in thick, dark ink on the receipt were 2 items, aspirin and a box of carpet tacks. I looked down at the carpet. My skin crawled. The carpet tacks were tiny, sharp little things used to secure the edge of the rug to the floorboards. I slowly lifted the edge of the rug right by the front door. The edge felt loose, and one by one, very carefully, I could see 5 tiny, silver-colored carpet tacks pushed up through the backing of the rug, their sharp points aimed straight up. Someone had been waiting in my hallway while I was asleep or looking out the window, quietly laying a small, painful trap. I backed away from the door, the terror finally breaking me. I ran for the emergency fire escape stairs. I had to get out. The cold didn't matter. I yanked the window open and leaned out onto the rusted metal grating. The blue light from the other building immediately shifted. It didn't waver. It just slid across the glass, across the dark brick, and settled perfectly on me. It was too bright. I shielded my eyes, but I could see just on the periphery of the beam that the light was coming from a very specific place. The corner of the window, a camera on a tripod angled perfectly, and behind the camera, a dark silhouette. I scrambled back inside, slamming the window shut. I was trapped. The blue light knew exactly where I was. Then the final sound. Not a tap, not a scrape, but a low, steady creaking sound. It was coming from the wall that separated me from 5B. It was the sound of a door opening, the door from 5B into my apartment. I stared at the wall. My apartment didn't share a door with 5B, there was no connection. But the creaking continued, slow and heavy, followed by a slight scraping sound like wood being dragged across a floor, and then a low, rasping breath. I looked at the wall, then at the Victor Hale ID card. What if the ID card wasn't Victor Hale? What if it was someone using his old apartment to get to mine? I backed into the darkest corner, the laptop light dying. In the black silence, the creaking stopped, and a voice, flat and dry, whispered from the direction of the wall. "The view is better from here, Marcus. You should have checked the crawl space under the bathtub." The crawl space under the bathtub. The only place I never checked. a maintenance access panel I assumed was sealed with concrete. I heard a heavy, soft thud from behind the wall, and then a final, clear sound, the light click of a deadbolt turning, the deadbolt on my own front door. I wasn't trapped in the apartment. I was trapped with him, the man who never blinked. Story 5. My name is Desmond. I'm not a bad guy, not really. I'm a high school history teacher with a crippling gambling debt. That's the simple truth that put me here, on a rusted-out suspension bridge overlooking the frigid Black River at 2 a.m. on November 25th. I was shivering so hard my teeth hurt. The wind coming off the water was a raw, brutal slap of cold. My contact, a man who only went by the broker, had given me 2 instructions: be there alone and bring the shovel. I was waiting for 40 minutes when a black van, unmarked and silent, finally rolled up and stopped 20 feet away. The side door hissed open, and a giant of a man, easily 6'6", wearing a ski mask and a long, dark trench coat, stepped out. He didn't look at me. He just walked to the railing. In his hand, he held a stainless steel lockbox. It looked like the kind banks use for safe deposit, heavy and built to last. He lifted it and secured it tightly to the bridge's main cable using thick, black zip ties. He turned, his masked face a blank, terrifying void. "You're Desmond." The voice was a deep, gravelly monotone devoid of inflection. "Yes, I have the money, my debt, I brought all of it." I gestured to the duffel bag beside me, which held $25,000, everything I owned and borrowed. He looked down at the bag, then back at the lockbox. "The debt has been renegotiated, Desmond. You don't pay us in cash anymore." My heart plummeted. "What do you mean? I sold my car, took a loan, this is everything." He stepped closer and I could smell the stale, cold metal scent clinging to him. "That box holds a ledger. Names, dates, locations, everything. It is also wired to a proximity bomb. 100 yards of wire running down to the water." He pulled out a heavy-duty bolt cutter from his coat. "The bridge is wired. If you attempt to cut the zip ties, the bomb is triggered. If you attempt to cross the bridge, the bomb is triggered. If you attempt to move the box, the bomb is triggered." He tossed the bolt cutter onto the asphalt. It hit with a dull, heavy thud. "There's a timer," he said, pointing with a gloved finger to a small, red digital display on the side of the lockbox. It showed 01:15:37, 75 minutes. When it hits 0, the box detonates, taking out a major section of this bridge and whatever is on it. I looked at the timer, then at the sheer drop to the black, rushing water below. "Why? What do you want from me?" "Simple, Desmond. The ledger must be recovered, but we can't be seen doing it." He walked back to the van and pulled out a second item. It was a long, dark gray cylinder, maybe 5 feet long, wrapped in industrial-grade plastic. It was the weight of a man. He dropped it onto the asphalt. The plastic split open, and I saw a glimpse of what was inside: a roll of black, oiled tarpaulin and a flash of pale, waxy skin. "You will use the bolt cutter to cut the wire, not the zip ties. You will lower the lockbox to the river bank. You will open the lockbox. The code is your mother's birthday, month, day, year, and retrieve the ledger. Then you will wrap this up and dispose of it in the deepest part of the river." He nudged the tarp-wrapped cylinder with his boot. "This is the collateral. If you fail to dispose of it, the contents of the ledger will be sent to the police, with your name and photo attached as the primary subject." He climbed back into the van. The door slid shut. As the engine started, he leaned out the window and whispered, "There's a sniper, Desmond. He has the bridge lights in his scope. No phones, no running, and you have to look down at what you're disposing of. We need to be sure you understand the stakes." The van vanished into the fog. I was alone with the wind, the timer, the black lockbox, and the horrifying bundle on the ground. I went straight for the tarp. I had to know what I was dealing with. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely peel back the plastic. Underneath was the tarpaulin, and under that was the very pale, very cold, very dead body of a man I recognized instantly, Detective Miller, the lead detective from the city's organized crime unit, the man who had been investigating the broker for 6 months. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the November sky. A single, small, neat hole was drilled directly through his forehead. I gagged, stumbling back. They hadn't just killed him, they delivered him to me. They were forcing me to become an accessory to his murder. I looked at the timer, 0108:45. I had to move. I grabbed the bolt cutters. My mind raced. If I cut the zip ties, the bridge explodes. If I cut the wire, the lockbox drops. But how to cut the wire without moving the box or the wire itself? I took a deep breath, fighting the panic. The wire was thick, running tautly down the main suspension cable. It was dark, almost invisible. I had to slide the cutter down the wire without putting any horizontal pressure on the box. I spent 10 excruciating minutes trying to secure the cutter to the wire. The cold was a constant distraction, making my fingers numb. Finally, snip, the wire parted cleanly. The lockbox didn't move, thank God. The bomb was proximity triggered, not contact triggered. Now the hard part. I used the rope I brought with the shovel, the lie I told myself, and secured one end to the box and the other to the railing. I carefully cut the zip ties. The box was heavy, easily 50 pounds. I slowly lowered it down, watching the rope disappear into the blackness of the river valley. When it hit the ground, I tied the rope off. 00:53:12. Time was bleeding away. I grabbed my shovel and the coiled cylinder containing Detective Miller. The sheer weight of the body was terrifying. I dragged him to the railing. I had to look at his face one last time. I slowly unwrapped the tarpaulin, exposing his vacant, frozen stare. Was the broker watching me from afar, waiting for this moment of confirmation? I wrapped him back up and pushed the body over the railing. It fell silently, swallowed instantly by the blackness of the river. The crime was done. Now the ledger. I scrambled down the sheer, wet embankment, using the thick suspension cables as my guide. My hands were raw, stinging. I reached the bottom, panting. I found the lockbox sitting on a patch of icy shale. 00:41:05. I worked the combination, 11:04:62. The lock snicked open. Inside there was no ledger. There was only a single folded piece of paper and a small, antique silver key. I unfolded the note, holding it close to my flashlight. It was handwritten, not typed. It said, "You're learning, Desmond, but you're slow. The ledger is hidden where you left your debt. You have 40 minutes to retrieve it and meet us on the river bank 10 miles south. Bring the key. And this time, don't miss the deadline." I looked back up at the bridge, the immense, rusted silhouette hanging over me. The duffel bag with all my money was still up there, exactly where I'd left it. Was the real bomb in the duffel bag? Was the broker watching me choose between the money and my life? And what was the silver key for? I scrambled back up the embankment. The timer reads 00:38:22. The real danger wasn't the bomb on the bridge. It was the fact that they knew exactly how desperate I was, and they were using my greed against me. I reached the top of the bridge, ran to the duffel bag and ripped it open. The money was still inside. No bomb, but tucked under the cash was a thick brown journal, the ledger. I grabbed it and the silver key. As I turned to run for my life, I heard a sound from the river below, not the rushing water. A single gunshot. It echoed up the valley, sharp and final. And seconds later, 3 things happened at once. A massive geyser of water erupted from the river, followed by a thunderous boom. The bomb was in the river, attached to the detective's body. The broker had just guaranteed that body would never be found intact. The red timer on the empty lockbox, still swinging from its cable, suddenly changed from the remaining time to "thank you." A flicker of light appeared in the windows of the black van, parked 10 miles south, watching the explosion. I ran with the ledger and the silver key, now a terrified accomplice, praying that the destination on the riverbank was not just the next stage of my own burial. Story 6. My name is Vivian, and the November storm was my punishment. I took a job as a house sitter for an old estate deep in rural Maine, a huge, gorgeous Victorian they called the Rookery. My only instructions were to keep the wood stove stoked and to keep the well house padlocked, especially after the snow started. The pay was incredible, enough to get me out of debt by Christmas. It was November 29th, the last night of the month. The blizzard outside was so thick I couldn't see the nearest fence post. The house was enormous and creaky, filled with shadows that seemed to pool and breathe in the candlelight. I was in the kitchen making tea when I noticed the key ring wasn't on the hook where I'd left it. It was a distinctive ring, a heavy brass circle with a dozen old, rusty keys and one new, shiny silver one, the key to the well house. I looked everywhere, under the mat, in the pockets of my jacket, in the junk drawer, gone. It must have fallen, but I hadn't moved it since breakfast. I forced myself to calm down. The well house was padlocked from the outside anyway. Even if the key was lost, the door was secure. But the house was too silent. The wind sounded like someone calling my name from far away. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight and went out to the back porch. The storm was a white wall. I had to see if the lock was still on the well house. I fought the wind and the snow for 50 feet until I reached the small, dark wooden structure. It looked ancient, leaning slightly, covered in clinging vines. I aimed the beam. The heavy black padlock was still hanging there, but the shackle was wide open. It wasn't locked. My stomach dropped. I knew I had secured it this morning. I always secured it. I pushed the door open a crack. A gust of icy, damp air rushed out, carrying a smell of moss, stagnant water, and something acrid like old metal. I shone the flashlight inside. The well was a circle of black stone in the center of the dirt floor, covered by a heavy, wooden lid bolted down with 3 thick screws. The bolts were all there. The lid was secure. Relief washed over me, quickly followed by the chilling realization. If the lid is secured and the lock was open, why did the key ring disappear? And who unlocked the padlock? As I backed out, I noticed a detail I hadn't seen before. Tucked into the snow right beside the door was a single, small, dark object. I bent down and picked it up. It was the silver key, the new one. It was ice cold, and a piece of my own hair, long and dark, was frozen to the head of it. I threw the key down and ran back to the house, slamming the kitchen door and jamming a chair under the handle. I locked myself in the library, the only room with a functional interior lock. I sat by the roaring fire, the silver key now lying on the desk beside me, wrapped in a napkin. I tried to rationalize it. I must have dropped the key on the porch, and the wind blew it to the well house. I must have forgotten to lock the padlock. But the hair, my hair, frozen to the key. I had pulled it back into a tight bun this morning. Around midnight, the fire was hot, but I was shivering. I heard the sound, not the wind, not the creaks of the house. A sound of faint, wet splashing, coming from under the house. The rookery was built on a partial fieldstone foundation, with a shallow, dirt crawl space under the main floor. The well house was 50 feet away. How could I hear splashing from under the house? I pressed my ear to the floor. The splashing continued, small and rhythmic, like someone dipping their hand into a bucket of water. Then a voice, a faint childish giggle. It was high, dry, and terrifyingly close. "Play in the dark, Vivian." I snatched my flashlight and aimed it at the floorboards. The wood was old but solid. I couldn't see anything. The giggling stopped. It was replaced by a sound that made my blood run cold, the distinct, metallic clink of keys hitting stone. The key ring. It was down there in the crawl space beneath the house. How did the keys get under the house, and who was playing with them? I backed away, scrambling up onto the heavy mahogany library desk, seeking height as if that would protect me. Then from the massive, multi-paned window behind me, I heard a sharp, cracking sound. I spun around. On the outside of the window, a small, dark shape was pressed against the glass. It looked like a child's hand, small with thin, bony fingers. And it was scraping a pattern into the condensation on the glass. The pattern was a crude drawing, a circle with 3 lines radiating outward, the same symbol from the last story, but drawn by a child's shaky hand. I screamed and jumped off the desk. I ran to the door, fumbling with the lock. I had to get out of the house. I didn't care about the storm. I flung the library door open and bolted toward the kitchen. As I passed the hall closet, a figure stepped out. It was a little girl, maybe 7 years old, wearing a thin, white, tattered nightgown. Her skin was pale blue, almost translucent, and her hair was a soaking wet tangle of black. She didn't have eyes, just smooth, pale skin where her sockets should have been. And in her hand, she was holding the brass key ring. The keys dangled loosely. She lifted the ring, shaking it gently. The keys made that terrifying clink, clink, clink sound. The little girl smiled, a wide, unnatural, slow smile that showed too many small teeth. "You dropped these, Vivian," she whispered, her voice like grinding stone. "I got them from the well of unmade things. Want to see?" I couldn't move. My feet were cemented to the floor. She reached out her free hand. It was dripping wet, and in the center of her palm, resting on the blue skin, was a single, perfect crow's feather. The same feather from the woods. "The well is waiting," she giggled. I finally broke. I pushed past her, not feeling a solid body but a rush of freezing, rotten air. I ran for the back door, tore the chair out of the way, and plunged out into the roaring November blizzard. I ran toward the well house, my mind utterly shattered, drawn by a terror I couldn't fight. I burst through the unlocked door. The heavy, bolted lid of the well was exactly as I left it, secure. But as I stood there panting, I looked down at the dirt floor around the well's edge. And there, meticulously arranged in a perfect circle, were 12 sets of tiny, bare, wet footprints, leading away from the well and back toward the house. The thing that had been under the house was now inside. The thing that came from the well was hunting me. I looked back at the house. In every single window, I saw the pale, blue face of the little girl, her wide, toothy smile frozen in the glass. I was trapped between the well of unmade things and the house full of its echoes. I knew, with a certainty that reached into my bones, that the only way to survive the storm was to return to the house, and the only way to survive the house was to open the well. Story 7. My name is Silas, and I never should have gone into the Blackwood, especially not in November when the trees lose their leaves and the forest sheds its illusions. I was a nature photographer, always chasing the elusive shot, and I'd heard rumors of an untouched, ancient grove deep in these mountains, trees so old they predated the first settlers. They called it the Whispering Woods because of the way the wind always seemed to carry faint, distant voices. It was November 20th, a day that started with a crisp, clear sky, but by noon, a thick, wet fog had rolled in, swallowing the sun and turning the woods into a monochrome maze. I had hiked for hours, deeper than I ever intended, drawn by the promise of the grove. My phone had died 3 hours ago, and my GPS unit was useless in this dense canopy. I realized I was truly lost when I found the carved deer antler. It was stuck upright in a mossy patch, right in the middle of a barely discernible game trail, not a natural shed. Someone had filed it down to a sharp point, then carved intricate, almost tribal patterns into its base. It looked ancient, stained dark with what I hoped was just dirt. I picked it up. It felt heavy, cold, and strangely warm at the same time, On one side, etched deeply into the bone, was a single stark symbol, a crude circle with 3 lines radiating outwards, like a claw mark. I stared at it, my heart starting to pound. This wasn't a hiking trail. This wasn't a national park. These were deep woods. No one should be out here, especially not leaving artifacts. I put the antler back exactly where I found it and tried to retrace my steps. But every tree looked the same now, shrouded in the oppressive fog. The whispers started then, too, faint, ethereal sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Was it just the wind playing tricks, or was something actually speaking? As dusk approached, the air grew colder and the fog thickened to soup. I needed shelter. I stumbled upon a small, derelict trapper cabin, just a leaning, single-room shack barely standing. The windows were long gone, replaced by empty black eyes. I pushed the rotten door open. The interior was choked with dust and cobwebs, smelling of damp earth and decay. In the corner, a crude stone fireplace stood, filled with ash. As I surveyed the room, my flashlight beam sweeping across the walls, I saw it. Scrawled on the cracked plaster directly above where a bed would have been was the exact same symbol as on the antler. The crude circle with 3 claw marks, repeated dozens of times, overlapping, fatting, like a desperate prayer or a warning. I shivered, a deep, bone-chilling cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. Who had been here? And what were they so terrified of that they carved this symbol everywhere? I decided to try and start a fire. Any warmth, any light would be better than the creeping darkness. I gathered some brittle, dry wood from inside the cabin, found an old tinderbox with some surprisingly dry matches. As the first sparks caught, I heard a sound from outside. A light, insistent scratching on the wooden outer wall of the cabin. Scratch, scratch, pause, scratch. I froze, my hand hovering over the kindling. It sounded like something with long claws testing the wood. I grabbed my camera, a heavy, expensive model, and held it like a weapon. "Hello," I called out, my voice hoarse. "Is anyone there?" The scratching stopped, utter silence save for the frantic pounding of my own heart. Then from just outside the shattered window, a new sound, a low, guttural chuckle. It was dry, ancient, and filled with a chilling, malevolent glee. It didn't sound human. I scrambled back from the window, pressing myself against the far wall. Was this what the trapper had been so afraid of? I managed to get the fire going, the flames leaping, casting dancing shadows. The light felt like a thin shield against the overwhelming darkness outside. But the laughter came again, closer this time, seeming to swirl around the cabin, just beyond the reach of the firelight. I was hallucinating, I had to be. Sleep deprivation, cold, fear, my mind was breaking. Then I saw it, peeking just above the rotten windowsill of the opposite window, a dark, thin shape. It was a stick, not a branch, but a carefully stripped, sharpened stick, and tied to the end of it, hanging limp, was a single, perfectly preserved crow's feather, black, oily, shimmering. The feather slowly, deliberately began to tap on the window frame. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't a person. It was too precise, too patient. Was it a trap? Was it a warning? I backed away, grabbing a small, rusted axe I'd found in the corner. My mind screamed at me to run, but where? I was deep in the blackwood, and something was clearly toying with me. The tapping stopped, and then from the other side of the cabin, the door, I heard the latch. The old, rusty latch began to rattle. Softly at first, then harder, as if something was trying to turn it from the outside. I stared at the door, transfixed. It was barred from the inside with a thick wooden beam. But the rattling continued, growing more insistent, the wood around the latch beginning to splinter. Then through the gap where the door didn't quite meet the frame, I saw it. A single glowing red eye peering in, not round like a human eye. It was elongated, almost reptilian, and pulsed with a faint internal light. It blinked slowly, once, twice. My blood ran cold. This wasn't an animal. This wasn't human. What kind of creature had glowing eyes and the patience to play with its prey? The red eye vanished from the crack. The rattling stopped. Silent, a terrifying, oppressive silence. I slumped against the wall, axe still clutched in my hand, my breath ragged. I was completely alone, completely hunted, and whatever it was intelligent. It was toying with me. Then from the darkness outside, I heard a new sound, a faint, beautiful melody, like a flute played by someone with immense skill. It was haunting, alluring, and completely out of place in this desolate wilderness. The melody seemed to float around the cabin, drawing me towards the open doorway. It sounded like a call, a promise of peace. Was it a trick? Was it a lure? I knew it was dangerous, but my mind was fractured. The whispers, the symbols, the eye, the tapping, it was too much. The melody offered a moment of respite, a sliver of hope. I took one step toward the door, then another. As I reached the threshold, the melody suddenly stopped. And from directly above the doorframe, suspended by some unseen means, I saw it. My camera, my expensive heavy camera, now hanging upside down, its lens pointed directly at me. And from the small, red recording light on the camera, a single, clear, digitized voice emanated, calm and conversational. "You found the old growth, Silas. You found it, and now it found you." I looked up at the camera, then out into the vast, silent, fog-shrouded forest. The whispers returned, louder now, no longer just wind, but a chorus of ancient, murmuring voices calling my name. And then just beyond the tree line, in the deepest part of the fog, two more red, glowing eyes appeared, then four, then six. A silent, unblinking audience waiting for my next move. Was the forest itself alive? Was it judging me or preparing for its harvest? I dropped the axe and ran, not toward the trail, not toward the melody, but deeper into the blackwood, into the very heart of the ancient grove, driven by a terror that had finally consumed my mind. I was just another echo in the whispering woods. Story 8. My name is Ethan. I'm a low-level accountant, or I was, until 3 days ago when I found myself chained in a forgotten sub-basement under an abandoned tannery. It's late November, maybe the 28th. I haven't seen the sun in 72 hours. The air is thick with the smell of old chemicals, damp concrete, and the constant, chilling sound of water dripping somewhere in the absolute blackness. My captor, a methodical, terrifying man named the Collector, left me here. He's not after money. He's after information about a data transfer I witnessed. He said he'd be back at midnight. At 11:25 p.m., I heard the main service door upstairs clank open. Footsteps, heavy, slow, and purposeful. My heart hammered against my ribs. He's early. But as the footsteps descended the first set of concrete stairs, I noticed something wrong. The Collector always wore hard-soled boots. These steps were softer, almost a shuffle, and there wasn't one set of steps. There were two. They stopped at the door to the sub-basement, the door my captor had welded shut from the outside. I whispered, "Hello, is someone there?" My voice was dry, cracking. The two shuffling noises paused. Then a new sound, the high, grating screech of metal being dragged across concrete. It was the sound of a cutting torch, but it was being applied quickly, brutally. Someone was burning through the welds. A moment later, the door shrieked open, ripping free of the melted metal, and crashed against the stone wall. Two silhouettes stood in the doorway, blocking the weak, single-bulb light from the main basement. They weren't the Collector. They were thinner, shorter. They looked like two wraiths dressed in oversized black clothing, carrying something long and thin. The first figure spoke, their voice a high, reedy whisper. "The one who knows the numbers is here." The second figure pointed the long, thin object at me. It wasn't a gun. It was a metal probe with a small, glowing red lens on the tip. It scanned my face, my chest, and the heavy chain around my wrist. "He's the target. The Collector secured him well," the second figure hissed, its voice equally reedy. "Who are you? Where's the Collector?" I stammered, pulling against the chain, which was anchored to a massive steel girder. The collector had a scheduled retrieval, the first one said, stepping fully into the gloom. I saw they wore thin, black gloves and their faces were obscured by scarves, but their eyes were large, unnaturally wide and perfectly black, reflecting the faint light. "We are here for the numbers. You have 10 minutes to comply or we begin the deconstruction." "I don't know the numbers," I lied, desperation making my voice sharp. "They were encrypted. I just saw the transfer signature." The second figure, standing by the door, reached up and flipped a switch I hadn't seen. A small, focused blue light snapped on, aimed at the girder 6 feet from me. I realized what they were planning. They weren't going to cut my chain. They were going to cut the girder. "The chain is tempered steel. It will take too long," the first figure said. "The anchor point is simpler. Give us the sequence, Ethan. A 10-digit number. We know you have it." I looked at the blue light. The light source was a small, high-powered acetylene torch, now heating the massive steel I was chained to. A thin, curling plume of acrid smoke began to rise. Then from the darkness behind them, from the main basement stairs, I heard a sound. A single, distinct, rhythmic tap. Tap, pause, tap, pause. The two figures froze instantly. Their large black eyes snapped toward the doorway. "He's early," the first one whispered, fear lacing their tone. "He was supposed to be in the city for another hour." The tapping continued, slow and heavy. That was the collector. The heavy, hard-soled boot tapping the concrete, announcing his presence. The second figure grabbed the cutting torch and threw it on the floor. "We're out, now. The numbers are not worth the exchange." "Wait," I yelled. "I'll give you the numbers, just get me out of this. It's 93,786. The first figure moved with shocking speed, darting toward me. But before they could get within reach, the tapping stopped. And the collector's voice, deep and resonant, boomed from the doorway. "The sub-basement is already occupied, scavengers. This harvest is mine." A massive crack split the air. The single light in the main basement shattered. We were plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. I heard the first figure scream, a wet, choked sound, followed by a sickening thud. Then the terrifying sound of rapid, brutal fighting. Heavy blows landing, short, sharp cries, and the sound of something metallic being ripped apart. The sub-basement was small, and the sounds of the struggle were deafening, playing out only 20 feet away in the pitch black. I was cowering, pulling on the chain. Did I just trade one monster for 2 more, only to witness them tear each other apart? The fighting stopped as suddenly as it began. Silence returned, broken only by the continued drip, drip, drip of water. Then the shuffle, a single shuffle closer to me. The 2 scavengers were down. A match scritched. A small yellow flame blossomed into life. It was the collector. He stood tall, his shadow engulfing the room. His face, usually unreadable, was set in a grim, satisfied mask. He looked down at the 2 figures. They were crumpled on the floor, unmoving. He kicked one gently with his boot. No response. He looked up at me, the match flame reflecting in his cold, dark eyes. "You attract attention, Ethan. That is bad for business." He walked over to the girder, pulling a small black case from his coat. He opened it. Inside, perfectly arranged, were 4 surgical instruments. "They were going to cut the steel," he said calmly, selecting a long, thin, needle-like instrument. "They wanted to take you whole. I prefer the knowledge intact." He knelt down beside me, holding the needle. "I have changed my method. The tension is now gone. The competition is eliminated." He lit another match. "I'm not going to ask for the number anymore, Ethan. I'm going to take it." He looked at my eyes. "The memory is in the hippocampus. It's too messy. You know what's faster, what's cleaner." He pointed the needle at my wrist, right where the skin met the cold steel of the chain. "The pain centers, the fear. It concentrates the mind, doesn't it? And when the mind is fully concentrated on the survival impulse, the unwanted data, the number, often floods the forefront. He pressed the needle's tip against my skin. It felt like a freezing speck of ice. Tell me the number and this goes away. Refuse, and you spend the rest of the night here, not with me, but with the two who just failed their retrieval. They'll wake up before I do. I looked down at the needle, then across the gloom at the two dark, unmoving shapes on the floor, waiting for the spark of life to return. Was he bluffing about their retrieval? Were they truly left for me? The freezing needle point pressed harder. I felt a drop of warm blood well up around the tip. 937, I choked out. The pain was too intense, the threat of being left with the bodies too overwhelming. He smiled, a terrifying, slow spreading of the lips. Good, Ethan. Now let's proceed with the final 7 digits. The November night is long and we have time to spare. He extinguished the match, plunging us into total darkness. The final 7 digits trapped between the needle, the chain, and the 2 dead or dying men at the edge of the sub-basement. My survival depended on my memory, and his methods were guaranteed to shatter it.